In the beginning, before the sundering of worlds and the casting down of nations, the elves dwelt in realms where starlight had not yet learned separation from shadow. The lands of Faerie stretched across boundaries mortals would later call impossible, and within those twilit kingdoms walked a people who had not yet learned the shape of their own ruin. They were children of Corellon Larithian, the first of the Seldarine, and they moved through forests that existed in multiple planes at once, singing songs that would become the foundation of all later magic. The elves knew no division then, no castes of sun and moon and shadow. They were simply the Telquesser, the people, and their cities rose in harmony with the ancient woods that predated the firmament itself. But within that unity, ambitions already stirred that would reshape not only elvenkind, but the very substance of the world below the world. The nature of the elves in those primordial ages reflected the chaotic beauty of their creator. Corellon had shaped them from his own divine essence during the wars that preceded mortal time, conflicts so ancient that even the dragons counted them as prehistory. The elves served as warriors, artists, and preservers of beauty in a cosmos still being contested by primordial forces. They built their first civilizations in Faerie itself, in Arvandor and the connected realms where the barriers between thought and reality remained gossamer thin. Magic flowed through them as naturally as breath, for they had been born from a god whose very being embodied the weave's most elegant possibilities. Their lives stretched across centuries, their memories holding epochs that would have broken shorter-lived minds. They developed arts and philosophies that mortal races would spend millennia attempting to comprehend. And in those long ages of Faerie existence, certain houses and bloodlines began to believe that beauty and power were not merely gifts, but birthrights that elevated them, above all other considerations. The migration of the elves from Faerie to the material world of Toril occurred across thousands of years, not as a single exodus but as waves of settlement and exploration. The reasons for this migration remain subjects of scholarly debate, with some texts claiming divine mandate and others suggesting simple wanderlust or even exile for particular factions. What remained certain was that the elves who came to Toril found a world already ancient, already scarred by the wars of creator races and the collapse of empires that had risen and fallen before elvenkind ever set foot on mortal soil. They established their first settlements in the regions that would become Faerieland, creating kingdoms that mirrored the glories they had left behind. The forests responded to their presence, growing taller and more vibrant, as if recognizing kindred spirits. The elves brought with them knowledge of high magic, rituals so powerful they could reshape continents and alter the fundamental nature of reality within carefully defined boundaries. They used this magic carefully at first, with reverence for the balance they had been taught to maintain. But as generations passed and memory of Faerie grew distant, some among them began to see high magic not as a sacred trust, but as a tool for dominion. The Crown Wars began not as a single conflict, but as a slow accumulation of grievances, territorial disputes, and philosophical divisions that eventually ignited into centuries of devastation. The elven kingdoms of Toril had multiplied and spread, each developing distinct cultures and magical traditions. Some remained devoted to the old ways of Corellon and the Seldarine, maintaining harmony with nature and the careful practice of magic within ethical bounds. Others grew proud and ambitious, seeing in their long lives and magical superiority the right to rule absolutely over the lands they claimed. The kingdom of Arivandar stood at the forefront of this imperial philosophy, its nobles believing that unity among elves could only be achieved through strength and that strength required conquest. The conflicts that erupted were not the simple clashes of armies but wars waged with magic that scarred the land itself. Forests burned with flames that would not die, rivers changed their courses or turned to poison, entire cities vanished in single nights, their populations scattered to madness or death. The Crown Wars would eventually be divided by historians into 5 distinct phases spanning more than 3,000 years, and by their conclusion, the face of Toril itself would be transformed. Among the elven nations, the kingdom that would become most central to the transformation of their people was Arivandar, but the seeds of the Drow were planted in the practices and beliefs of several competing powers. The noble houses of these kingdoms had always maintained strict hierarchies, with the eldest bloodlines claiming descent from the first elves to walk Toril, or even from specific members of the Seldarine. These houses competed for influence through displays of magical prowess, political maneuvering, and the accumulation of ancient lore. Some houses, particularly those in the southern kingdoms, began to explore magical traditions that the priests of Corellon deemed dangerous or blasphemous. They delved into shadow magic and learned to draw power from sources other than the reverence of nature and the blessings of the Seldarine. They studied the ruins of the creator races, extracting secrets from civilizations that had destroyed themselves through unchecked ambition. And most significantly, they began to question why the Seldarine deserved their worship at all. When elvish magic could achieve such wonders without divine intervention, these houses did not yet constitute a separate people, but their philosophies were diverging from the mainstream of elven culture in ways that would prove irreversible. The specific moment when particular elven houses crossed from heterodoxy into active rebellion against the Seldarine remained obscured by propaganda and the passage of millennia. What survived in the historical record were fragments, suggestions, and the testimony of later accounts that might themselves have been distorted by theological necessity. Certain noble houses in the kingdom of Ilithir, located in the southern reaches of the elven domains, became associated with practices that appalled their neighbors. They enslaved other races without compunction, treating even fellow elves as property when political circumstances made such treatment possible. They performed rituals in darkness, calling on powers that predated the current cosmological order. Some texts suggested they made contact with entities from the abyss, though whether as worshippers or would-be masters remained unclear. The houses of Ilithir justified their actions through a philosophy that rejected the pastoral idealism of Corellon's teachings, arguing instead that true beauty and perfection required the will to dominate, to impose order through strength, and to accept that some beings were simply superior to others. These were not yet the Drow, but they were becoming something that could no longer call itself simply elven. The other elven kingdoms watched Ilithir with growing horror and fascination. Diplomatic missions were dispatched, attempting to bring the wayward kingdom back into the fold of accepted elven civilization. Priests of Corellon and the other Seldarine traveled to Ilithir's cities, debating with its philosophers and warning of divine consequences. For a time, it seemed possible that reconciliation might occur, that the extreme elements within Ilithir might be marginalized by more moderate voices. But the crown wars were reaching their peak intensity, and Ilithir's noble houses saw opportunity in the chaos. They allied with Mieritar against Arivandar, not out of any love for that kingdom, but because the alliance offered chances to expand their own power and test their dark magics in warfare. The battles that followed demonstrated capabilities that shocked even the jaded veterans of the long wars. Ilithiri mages wielded shadow magic that could strip the soul from a living body. They summoned creatures from lower planes that fought with nihilistic fury. They showed no mercy and took no prisoners except as sacrifices or slaves. The other elven kingdoms began to understand that Ilithir was not merely a political problem, but an existential threat to everything elvenkind claimed to represent. The destruction of Mieritar became the event that sealed Ilithir's fate, though Ilithiri mages were not solely responsible for that catastrophe. Arivandar had been the primary aggressor, and its high mages performed the ritual that transformed Mieritar's forests into the wasteland that would be known as the High Moor. But Ilithiri houses participated in the attacks that preceded the ritual, and their actions after Mieritar's fall showed such callous disregard for elven life that the survivor kingdoms could no longer overlook their transgressions. The Ilithiri enslaved refugees. They desecrated the sites where Mieritari dead had been laid to rest. They claimed territories without negotiation, enforcing their rule through terror and dark magic. The coronal of Arivandar, despite his own kingdom's guilt in Mieritar's destruction, joined with other elven rulers in declaring that Ilithir had abandoned the way of Corellon and must be brought to account. Plans were made for a joint military campaign, but before mortal armies could march, the Seldarine themselves intervened in a manner that would echo through history as both judgment and warning. Corellon Larethian looked upon the children who had forsaken his teachings, and what he felt in that moment the texts could only describe as sorrow beyond measure. The god who embodied beauty and art, whose being reflected the highest aspirations of elven kind, saw in the Ilithiari a perversion of everything he had intended when he shaped the elves from his own essence. The other members of the Seldarine stood with him, goddess and god united in recognition that action must be taken. What precisely occurred in the divine councils remained known only to the gods themselves, but the result manifested in the mortal world as catastrophe and transformation combined. The Seldarine reached down and struck at Ilithia with power that made even the Crown War's worst atrocities seem small by comparison. The very substance of reality buckled under divine wrath. Cities collapsed as if their foundations had been torn from beneath them. The earth opened and swallowed entire regions. Magical defenses that had taken centuries to construct shattered like pottery under a hammer, and most significantly, the Ilithiari themselves were changed, cursed, transformed into living monuments to what happened when elves turned from the light of Corellon's grace. Their skin, which had ranged through the spectrum of elven complexion from pale cream to warm bronze, darkened to shades of black and deep blue and midnight purple. Their hair, once gold or auburn or black, became white or silver, stark against their transformed skin. Their eyes, which had held the colors of forest and sky and earth, became crimson or violet, or the red of fresh blood. The Ilithiari screamed as the transformation took them, as their bodies became marks of their transgressions, as they were remade into something that could never again walk comfortably in the sunlight their people had always known. But the physical changes were merely the most obvious aspect of the curse. The Seldarine severed the connection between these elves and the divine grace that had always sustained their people. Where once they had felt the presence of Corellon as a distant but reassuring warmth, now they felt only absence. The natural magic that had flowed through elven bloodlines since the first days became tainted, twisted, requiring new techniques and new sources to channel effectively. And the light of the sun itself became painful to them, burning their transformed eyes and making their new skin ache with exposure. The curse was comprehensive and deliberate, designed to mark these elves as fallen and to drive them from the surface world they had sullied with their presence. The survivors of Ilithia fled underground, for the surface offered them only pain and the hatred of their former kin. The earth that had swallowed their cities became their refuge and their prison. They descended through newly opened chasms and ancient caverns, following paths that led down beyond the shallow caves into the vast network of tunnels and chambers that predated even the creator races. This realm, which would become known as the Underdark, was not empty. It held civilizations of its own, creatures and peoples adapted to perpetual darkness and dangers that had evolved in isolation from the surface world for eons beyond counting. The transformed Ilithiari were not prepared for what they found in the deep places. They were refugees, traumatized and scattered, carrying only what they had been able to grab in their flight. Many died in those first years underground, killed by the Underdark's predators or its environmental hazards or simple despair. The survivors learned quickly that the skills and knowledge that had served them on the surface were inadequate in the lightless depths. They adapted or perished, and the adaptation required them to become something harder, more vicious, more willing to do whatever survival demanded. In the darkness, a voice called to them, and that voice changed everything. Lolth had been known on the surface by other names, had been counted among the Seldarine in ages past as Aroashni, consort to Corellon and mother to gods who still held positions of honor. But that was before her betrayal, before she had plotted with the ancient power Malar to destroy Corellon during a period of divine conflict. Her conspiracy had been discovered and thwarted, and for her treachery, Corellon and the other Seldarine had cast her down, transforming her into a demon queen and banishing her to the abyss. She became the Spider Queen, taking the form of a monstrous arachnid whose webs stretched across multiple layers of the infinite depths. She had been stripped of her position among the Seldarine and transformed into an exemplar of cruelty, treachery, and dominion through fear. And in the transformed Ilithairi, cast down and cursed by the same gods who had punished her, Lolth saw opportunity for revenge and for worship from a people who would have nowhere else to turn. Her priests came first in dreams, visions that showed the suffering refugees that their abandonment by the Seldarine need not mean abandonment by all divine powers. Lolth offered strength in exchange for worship. She promised not redemption but transcendence, arguing that the curse laid upon them by Corellon was in fact a blessing that had freed them from weak-minded adherence to outdated ideals. Where the Seldarine preached harmony and beauty, Lolth taught domination and the perfection of will through constant struggle. Where Corellon asked for reverence toward nature, Lolth demanded that her followers bend nature to their purposes or destroy it. Where the elven gods had valued community and long-term thinking, Lolth glorified individual achievement, cunning, and the willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything for personal advancement. Her philosophy resonated with the bitterness the transformed Ilithairi felt toward the gods who had cursed them. It provided structure and meaning in the chaos of their underground existence, and most practically, it offered magical power through a divine connection the curse had not severed. Because Lolth was no longer counted among the Seldarine the curse had been designed to cut them off from. Not all the transformed Ilithairi accepted Lolth's offer. Some rejected her as simply another god demanding worship, clinging to the magical traditions their people had developed before the curse. Others attempted to make peace with the Seldarine, believing that through sufficient penance and change they might earn forgiveness and transformation back into their original forms. A few turned to other dark powers, seeking patrons among the gods of shadow, death, and secrets, who also offered strength to those willing to pay the price. But Lolth's followers proved the most successful at surviving and thriving in the Underdark. Her priests received spells that allowed them to command the spiders that infested the deep places, turning potential predators into servants and guards. Her teachings created a ruthless hierarchy where only the strongest and most cunning rose to power, ensuring that the leaders of her people would be capable survivors rather than weak idealists. And her divine power protected her faithful from some of the Underdark's worst dangers, granting them safe passage through regions where others perished. Within a few generations, the worship of Lolth had become dominant among the transformed Ilithairi, and those who refused to bow to the Spider Queen found themselves marginalized, enslaved, or eliminated by their more zealous kin. The name Drow emerged during these early centuries underground, though its origin remained disputed by scholars. Some texts claimed it derived from an ancient elven word meaning traitor or accursed, a name given to them by their surface cousins. Others suggested it came from an Underdark language, the transformed Ilithairi, adopted from earlier inhabitants of the deep places. Still other sources indicated the Drow chose the name themselves, embracing it as a mark of their separation from the surface elves they now despised. Regardless of its etymology, the term came to define this new people who were no longer truly elven in culture or philosophy despite their biological heritage. The Drow were not simply cursed elves, but a distinct civilization forged in darkness, shaped by Lolth's teachings, and hardened by the Underdark's unforgiving environment. They carried memories of the surface world, passing down through generations stories of forests they would never walk and sunlight they could not bear. These memories became twisted over time, transformed into propaganda that portrayed the surface elves as weak and foolish, clinging to outdated notions of harmony, while the Drow had evolved into something superior through their suffering and adaptation. The first Drow cities arose in caverns that offered strategic advantages and access to resources. The Underdark was not uniformly hostile, despite its dangers. Vast chambers existed where stone forests of stalagmites rose hundreds of feet toward vaulted ceilings. Underground seas stretched beyond the reach of torchlight, their waters home to creatures that had never known the sun. Fungal forests grew in regions where magical radiation or natural processes provided energy for growth, creating ecosystems that could support populations. The Drow found these places and claimed them, driving out or subjugating previous inhabitants. They built structures that reflected both their elven heritage and their new reality, creating architecture that emphasized function and defensibility while incorporating the aesthetic sensibilities they had inherited from their ancestors. Stalactites were carved into towers and homes. Stalagmites became fortifications. The natural structures of the Underdark were enhanced and modified through magic and labor until they became cities that rivaled anything on the surface for complexity and sophistication, if not for beauty by surface standards. Menzoberranzan rose to become the most famous and powerful of the Drow cities, though it was neither the first nor the largest. Founded in a cavern complex along the edge of an underground sea, Menzoberranzan occupied a position that offered both natural defenses and access to trade routes through the Underdark. The city's founders established it according to principles laid down by Lolth's clergy, creating a society structured around noble houses ruled by priestesses of the Spider Queen. These matrons wielded absolute authority within their houses, commanding warriors, wizards, and workers with the backing of divine power. The houses competed ruthlessly for position and influence, engaging in constant political maneuvering, assassination, and occasional open warfare. Lolth encouraged this conflict, teaching that chaos and struggle refined her people and proved which bloodlines deserved to rule. The weak perished, and the strong grew stronger, creating a society where paranoia and ambition became survival traits rather than character flaws. Male Drow occupied subordinate positions, valued for their skills as warriors, and wizards but excluded from the highest positions of religious and political authority. This matriarchal structure reflected Lolth's nature and her teachings, elevating females as inherently superior and forcing males to prove their worth through service or through the rare cunning that might see them rise despite their gender. The city expanded over centuries as new houses rose and old ones fell, as territory was claimed and resources exploited. The cavern complex that housed Menzoberranzan grew to accommodate tens of thousands of Drow, plus countless slaves taken from other races. The architecture developed its own distinct character, combining the natural formations with worked stone in ways that created a cityscape both magnificent and unsettling. Walkways connected towers that hung from the cavern ceiling. Whole districts occupied areas carved from the walls. At the city's heart stood the great Temple of Lolth, a structure where the Spider Queen's clergy performed rituals that reinforced her dominion over the Drow and channeled her power into the city's defenses. The houses maintained their own compounds, fortified strongholds where they trained their warriors, taught their wizards, and plotted against their rivals. The streets between compounds teemed with lesser Drow, those not fortunate enough to belong to powerful houses, but who still played roles in the city's economy and military. Slaves worked in the mines and fungus farms that fed the population, their lives measured in years or decades rather than the centuries Drow themselves enjoyed. Menzoberranzan became a symbol of what the Drow had become, a civilization of dark grandeur built on cruelty, held together by religious fervor and the constant threat of violence. Other cities followed similar patterns, though each developed unique characteristics based on local conditions and the particular houses that founded them. Ched Nasad clung to the walls of a vast chasm, its structures connected by bridges of stone and magic that spanned impossible distances. The city's inhabitants became masters of aerial combat and magic, adapting to an environment where falling meant death. Erindlin occupied a cavern where patches of Faerzres, the strange magical radiation unique to certain Underdark regions, created zones of wild magic that Drow wizards learned to exploit despite the risks. The city became famous for producing powerful arcane casters willing to experiment with dangerous techniques. Vieldrin Shah was constructed in secret, its location known only to those who lived there and the select few trusted with the knowledge, making it a haven for exiles and heretics who had fled other Drow cities. Each city developed its own culture within the broader framework of Drow civilization, its own hierarchies of houses, its own relationships with Lolth and other powers. its own strategies for survival in the hostile expanse of the Underdark. Trade networks developed between the cities and extended outward to other Underdark civilizations. The Drow proved skilled merchants and raiders both, comfortable with exchange or theft, as circumstances dictated. They traded worked goods, magical items, and slaves with the Duergar, the grim dwarves who had also been transformed and cast down in ancient times. They negotiated warily with mind flayers, the Illithid whose psychic powers made them dangerous trading partners. They raided settlements of the Svirfneblin, the deep gnomes whose gems and metalworking skills made them valuable targets. Surface raids became another source of resources and slaves, with Drow war parties ascending through caves and tunnels to strike at isolated communities before disappearing back into the earth. These raids served multiple purposes beyond simple plunder. They kept surface dwellers terrified of the Drow, discouraging exploration of the Underdark. They provided opportunities for young warriors to prove themselves in combat, and they allowed the Drow to gather intelligence about surface civilizations, knowledge that might prove useful in future conflicts. The raids also reinforced the Drow's image of themselves as superior to surface peoples, demonstrating through violence that their transformation had made them more capable predators rather than pitiful victims. Within Drow society, the structure of noble houses became the defining organizational principle that shaped every aspect of life. A house consisted of the matron who ruled it, her daughters, and other female relatives who might someday succeed her, the males of the bloodline who served as warriors and wizards, and various lesser members and servants who filled supporting roles. The matron's word was absolute law within her house, enforced through divine magic, political authority, and the genuine love and loyalty she could command from family members. Challenging a matron openly meant death or worse, transformation into a Dryder, the horrible fusion of drow and spider that served as both punishment and object lesson. But challenges came nonetheless, usually from ambitious daughters who believed themselves ready to assume control, or from subordinate houses seeking to rise at the expense of their betters. These conflicts were waged in shadow, through poison and assassination, and carefully orchestrated social destruction, because Lolth's one absolute prohibition was against open civil war that might weaken the Drow as a whole. The 8 ruling houses of Menzoberranzan formed a council that theoretically governed the city, though in practice they spent more energy on interfering with each other than on actual governance. The first house held the position of greatest prestige and practical authority, its matron serving as the city's ultimate arbiter in matters that affected all houses. But that position was not permanent. Any house could challenge for supremacy if it believed itself strong enough, and if it succeeded in destroying or subjugating the current first house, it would take that place in the hierarchy. The other houses shifted positions constantly as fortunes rose and fell, as alliances formed and dissolved. As centuries of careful planning culminated in single nights of violence and transformation, Lolth watched these conflicts with approval, occasionally sending signs that indicated her favor had shifted from one house to another. A matron who lost Lolth's favor found her house vulnerable, its defenses weakened, its enemies emboldened. A matron who gained special notice from the Spider Queen could rise meteorically, crushing rivals and seizing opportunities that had seemed impossible before divine intervention tilted the scales. Male Drow navigated this society from a position of structural disadvantage, knowing that no amount of skill or ambition would allow them to hold ultimate authority. The most talented became weapons masters, leading the warriors who defended their houses and struck at enemies. Others pursued arcane magic, becoming wizards whose power could rival or exceed that of the priestesses who outranked them socially. A few became consorts to matrons, using charm and cunning to influence events from behind the throne. But always they lived with the knowledge that they were expendable, that a matron could sacrifice them without remorse if circumstances required it, that their achievements would be credited to their house rather than to them personally. Some accepted this reality and thrived within its constraints, becoming legendary fighters or archmages whose names were spoken with respect even by other houses. Others chafed under the restrictions, harboring resentments that occasionally led to betrayal or flight from Drow society altogether. These males, the rogues and exiles, would play roles in stories the surface world would eventually learn, their alienation from their own people making them accessible in ways typical Drow never could be. Magic among the Drow evolved along paths distinct from both surface elven traditions and the practices of other Underdark races. The curse that had transformed them had disrupted their natural connection to the weave, requiring them to develop new techniques for accessing and channeling magical energy. Drow wizards became masters of darkness and shadow, learning to manipulate the absence of light as a tangible force. They developed spells that created zones of absolute darkness, impenetrable even to dark vision, giving them advantage over enemies who relied on light. They learned to summon and bind creatures from the plane of shadow and the abyss, putting demons and worse to service in their wars. And they explored the Feasres, learning to draw power from that strange radiation despite its tendency to cause wild and unpredictable effects. The combination of traditional arcane study and uniquely Drow innovations created a magical tradition that surface wizards found both fascinating and terrifying when they encountered. Clerical magic came directly from Lolth and reflected her nature as a demon queen rather than a traditional deity. Her priestesses received powers that emphasized domination, destruction, and the infliction of pain. They could summon swarms of spiders that obeyed their commands absolutely. They could inflict curses that left victims weakened or maddened. They could transform enemies into driders or other arachnid abominations. And most significantly, they served as conduits for Lolth's will, interpreting her desires and enforcing her commandments upon Drow society. The priestesses underwent rigorous training at the temple schools, learning not only spells but the complex etiquette and theology that governed Drow religion. They studied the history of Lolth's betrayal of Corellon and her transformation into the Spider Queen, learning to present it not as a fall from grace but as liberation from servitude. They memorized the countless tests and trials Lolth demanded of her followers, understanding that their goddess valued struggle and that her favor had to be earned continually rather than assumed. And they learned to recognize the signs of Lolth's displeasure, the subtle indications that a house had fallen from grace and would soon face destruction unless drastic action was taken to regain divine approval. The economy of Drow cities rested on slavery and the exploitation of both natural resources and conquered peoples. The Underdark offered ores and gems that surface mines could not match, minerals and crystals with unique properties useful in magic and crafting. Drow metallurgists became famous for their work with adamantine, the incredibly hard metal that could be forged into weapons and armor of legendary quality. They also mastered the use of spider silk, harvesting it from giant spiders and weaving it into cloth that was both beautiful and strong, resistant to weapons and magic alike. These goods could be traded with other Underdark races or smuggled to the surface through carefully maintained contacts with unscrupulous merchants. But the foundation of the economy was the labor of slaves, captives taken in raids or purchased from other Underdark peoples. These slaves worked the mines, tended the fungus farms, cleaned the houses of the noble families, and served as subjects for magical experiments. Their lives were brutish and short by any standard except comparison to those enslaved by mind flayers or worse. Drow saw nothing wrong with this system, viewing it as natural that superior beings would rule inferior ones. Centuries passed, and the Drow civilization solidified into its characteristic patterns. The cities grew and their populations increased. The noble houses waged their eternal shadow wars. The priestesses maintained their iron grip on society through the authority of Lolth. Raids on the surface continued, bringing back plunder and terrified captives. The Drow developed arts and literature that reflected their philosophy, creating works that celebrated cunning, betrayal, and the exercise of power. They composed poetry that found beauty in darkness and decay. They carved sculptures that captured the moment of an enemy's death. They performed plays that dramatized famous betrayals and successful assassinations. This was their culture, alien to surface sensibilities but internally coherent and sophisticated by any objective measure. They were not mindless monsters, but a fully realized civilization with its own values, its own internal logic, and its own understanding of meaning and purpose. That their values appalled outsiders did not concern them. They were Drow, the people who had been cast down and had risen again stronger and more perfect than the weak elves who had banished them. But the cosmos itself was not static, and events on scales beyond mortal comprehension occasionally reached down to reshape even societies as insular as the Drow. The time of troubles arrived in the Year of Shadows as a pace, catastrophe that affected every deity and every faithful worshipper across Toriel and the plains beyond. The overgod Au, responding to the theft of the Tablets of Fate by the deities Bane and Merkul, cast all the gods out of their divine realms and forced them to walk Toriel as mortals. Divine magic failed or became unpredictable as the gods struggled to maintain their portfolios while trapped in vulnerable physical forms. Chaos erupted across the world as priests lost contact with their deities, as divine servants were left without guidance, as the fundamental assumptions that had governed religious life for millennia suddenly proved unreliable. The Drow were not exempt from this upheaval. Lolth, like all other deities, found herself ejected from the demon web pits and forced into a physical manifestation somewhere in the wider world. The crisis among the priestesshood of Lolth became immediately apparent when prayers went unanswered and spells failed. The matrons who ruled the great houses found themselves cut off from the divine power that undergirded their authority. Lesser priestesses panicked, unable to comprehend why the Spider Queen had abandoned them. Lolth's silence created a vacuum of religious authority that various factions attempted to fill. Some priestesses claimed they could still feel Lolth's presence and that the goddess was simply testing their faith. Others argued that Lolth had been destroyed by rival powers and that the Drow needed to find new deities to serve. A few bold voices suggested that perhaps the Drow no longer needed gods at all, that they had grown strong enough to stand without divine oversight. These debates occurred against a background of rising chaos as the houses of the great cities realized that the balance of power had shifted fundamentally. Matrons who had relied on divine magic found themselves vulnerable to ambitious subordinates who possessed strong arcane abilities. Houses that had commanded respect through religious authority discovered that without Lolth's backing, they could be challenged openly. The time of troubles lasted only a single year by the calendar of surface lands, though those who lived through it experienced time that felt much longer. Eventually, Au resolved the crisis, punishing the guilty deities and returning the others to their divine realms with new restrictions and commandments. Lolth returned to the demon web pits, resuming her throne as Spider Queen and immediately reaching out to her faithful to re-establish the bonds that had been severed. But the year of her absence had revealed uncomfortable truths to the Drow. They had seen that their civilization could function without divine guidance. They had witnessed priestesses stripped of power and houses rising and falling according to purely temporal considerations. And some had begun to question whether absolute devotion to Lolth truly served Drow interests or merely the interests of the Spider Queen herself. Lolth moved swiftly to reassert her dominion, granting great powers to priestesses who had remained faithful during her absence and punishing those who had wavered. But the questions remained, unspoken perhaps but not forgotten, planted like seeds that would grow in later years when Lolth's silence came again. The surface world's relationship with the Drow had always been characterized by hostility and fear, but certain individuals and groups maintained contact despite the dangers. Merchants in shadowy markets traded with Drow intermediaries, valuing Drow craftswork highly enough to overcome moral qualms about supporting a slave economy. Wizards seeking forbidden knowledge sometimes descended into the Underdark to learn from Drow archmages, trading surface secrets for dark insights. And there were always the renegades, Drow who had abandoned their people and sought new lives on the surface despite the pain it caused them. These surface Drow faced impossible challenges, marked by their appearance, as members of a race universally despised, yet unable to return to the Underdark without facing execution as traitors. Most died quickly, killed by adventurers who did not stop to ask questions, or by their own people's assassins who hunted down those who fled. A few survived, finding places in communities willing to judge them by actions rather than appearance, or creating solitary existences in remote areas where they encountered few others. The most famous of these renegades would become known to surface dwellers through stories that transformed him into something almost mythical. Drizzt Do'Urden abandoned Menzoberranzan after witnessing one too many atrocities and came to reject everything Drow society represented. His story was exceptional, precisely because he survived and thrived despite his origins, finding companions who accepted him and proving through countless deeds that birth did not dictate destiny. But Drizzt's fame on the surface world had complex effects on how others perceived the Drow. To some, he represented proof that Drow could change, that they were not inherently evil, but rather products of a terrible culture that could be escaped. To others, he was the exception that proved the rule, the single good Drow whose very uniqueness confirmed that the rest of his race was beyond redemption. And among the Drow themselves, his name became a curse, an example of the ultimate betrayal that matrons used to frighten their children and reinforce the importance of absolute loyalty to house and goddess. The centuries following the time of troubles saw changes in the wider world that affected even the deep places. The great empires of the surface world rose and fell, wars reshaped political boundaries, and new powers emerged that threatened old balances. The Drow monitored these changes through their network of spies and surface contacts, always alert for opportunities or threats. They expanded their territories in the Underdark, coming into conflict with the Mind Flayer Empire of Orendal and the Duergar kingdoms. They refined their magical arts, developing new spells and creating artifacts of terrible power, and they continued their eternal internal conflicts, the houses rising and falling in patterns that would have seemed chaotic to outsiders, but which followed their own internal logic of ambition, betrayal, and divine favor. In the year of wild magic, a new crisis emerged that would test Drow civilization as thoroughly as the time of troubles had. Lolth fell silent once again, and this time her absence lasted not months but years. The event became known as the Silence of Lolth, and it provoked responses far more dramatic than the brief disruption of the time of troubles. The Spider Queen cut off all contact with her priestesses without explanation or warning. Prayers went unanswered, spells failed. No sign came from the demon web pits to indicate whether Lolth lived or had been destroyed by some cosmic enemy. The priestesshood, which had regained its authority and confidence after the time of troubles, found itself in crisis once more. But this time the crisis extended longer and cut deeper, raising questions that could not be suppressed or answered through reassurances of faith. The silence shattered the careful power structures that governed Drow society. Matrons who could not call upon Lolth's magic became vulnerable to challenges from powerful males who commanded arcane forces. Houses whose strength had rested on religious authority found themselves outmatched by rivals who had cultivated temporal power. The rules that had governed noble behavior for millennia began to erode as desperation overtook tradition. Open warfare broke out in some cities as houses attempted to seize advantage while their enemies were weakened. In others, councils formed to try to maintain order in the absence of religious guidance. Some priestesses turned to other deities, seeking new sources of divine magic, even if it meant betraying the Spider Queen. Vaeron, the Drow god of thieves and males who had always competed with his mother Lolth for worshippers, gained new followers among those who believed the goddess had abandoned them. Kiaran Sali, the Drow deity of undeath, attracted priestesses willing to embrace darker paths if it meant retaining power. Even Eilistri, the goddess of surface Drow and redemption, who had once been counted among the Seldarine before she voluntarily descended to help the cursed, found new supplicants among those desperate for any divine connection. The War of the Spider Queen, as the conflict came to be known, was not a single battle but a cascade of events that reshaped Drow civilization. A group of powerful priestesses and wizards from Menzoberranzan embarked on a quest to discover why Lolth had fallen silent and whether she could be restored to activity. Their journey took them through the layers of the abyss and into the demon web pits itself, where they discovered that Lolth had deliberately withdrawn from contact while she underwent a transformation of her own. The Spider Queen was becoming something greater, ascending to true godhood rather than remaining merely a demon lord with divine portfolios. The process required absolute isolation and concentration, and Lolth had not warned her followers because their faith needed to be tested. Those who remained loyal during her absence would be rewarded. Those who turned to other powers or who used her silence to advance purely personal agendas would face her wrath when she returned. Lolth's return marked the beginning of a new age for the Drow, one in which her power and authority were even more absolute than before. She emerged from her transformation as a true greater deity, no longer limited by her origin as a cast-down member of the Seldarine, but instead fully realized as an independent cosmic force. Her first act was to reward those houses and individuals who had remained faithful, granting them unprecedented powers and elevating their positions within Drow society. Her second act was to punish the faithless, destroying houses that had turned to other deities and transforming their members into driders or worse. The message was clear and uncompromising. Lolth would tolerate no rivals for the devotion of the Drow, and any who imagined they could abandon her would learn the cost of such presumption. The priestesshood regained its authority with interest, now backed by a goddess whose power had grown rather than diminished during her absence. The period following Lolth's return saw a consolidation of her control over Drow civilization, but also the emergence of fault lines that would never fully heal. The years of silence had broken something in the absolute certainty that had characterized Drow society for millennia. Doubts had been planted, questions raised that could not be fully suppressed even by displays of divine power. Some Drow had discovered they could survive, and even thrive without Lolth's direct oversight, and that knowledge could not be completely erased. The worship of Vairon and other alternative deities continued in secret, protected by careful protocols and the patronage of houses willing to risk Lolth's anger for the advantages diverse divine support might offer. And the example of Drow who had fled to the surface or who worshipped Ilistri created ongoing pressure, a constant reminder that alternatives existed even if they came at terrible cost. The world above was changing in ways that would eventually affect even the deepest places. The spell plague struck in the year of blue fire when the goddess Mystra was murdered and the weave itself was torn asunder. The resulting magical catastrophe reshaped continents, destroyed nations, and altered the fundamental laws governing how magic functioned. The Drow, dependent as they were on magic for everything from warfare to daily life, felt the spell plague's effects immediately. Spells that had worked for thousands of years suddenly failed or produced wildly different results. Magical items lost their power or transformed into dangerous artifacts that harmed their wielders. The Fairsres in certain regions of the Underdark flared to deadly intensity, making areas that had been habitable into death zones where exposure meant transformation or dissolution. Cities were damaged as magical defenses failed or enchantments collapsed. House compounds that had stood for millennia crumbled when the spells holding them together unraveled. The chaos of the spell plague offered opportunities for ambitious houses and individuals willing to take risks. New sources of power emerged as the changed weave made previously impossible magics suddenly accessible. Wizards who adapted quickly to the new rules found themselves more powerful than they had been before, while those who clung to old methods struggled to cast even simple spells. The disruption allowed some houses to rise dramatically, seizing territories and resources while their traditional rivals were weakened by the magical changes. It also created openings for non-Drow powers to push into areas of the Underdark previously controlled by Drow cities, forcing defensive conflicts that reshaped the political landscape of the deep places. The Drow survived as they always had, through adaptation and ruthless exploitation of changed circumstances, but the spell plague marked another moment when their civilization was tested and transformed by forces beyond their control. The Sundering arrived a century later as reality itself was restructured once more. The goddess Mystra was restored, the weave was healed, and the worlds that had been merged during the spell plague were separated again. The changes rippled through every aspect of existence, altering not just magic, but fundamental cosmology. For the Drow, the Sundering brought both familiar patterns and unexpected transformations. The Weave's restoration made traditional magic reliable again, allowing wizards to reclaim techniques that had been lost or altered during the spell plague. The established houses reasserted control in cities where chaos had allowed upstarts to challenge traditional hierarchies. But the Sundering also introduced new elements into Drow civilization that reflected changes in the wider world's understanding of morality and choice. The modern era of Drow existence was characterized by increasing complexity and the fracturing of old certainties. Where once Drow society had been monolithic in its devotion to Lolth and its acceptance of traditional structures, now multiple factions competed for influence and followers. The mainstream, centered in cities like Menzoberranzan and ruled by matrons loyal to the Spider Queen, remained the dominant force among the Drow. These traditionalists continued to practice slavery, engage in surface raids, and maintain the brutal hierarchies that had defined their civilization for thousands of years. They viewed themselves as the true inheritors of the Elithieri legacy, perfected through suffering and made superior through their willingness to embrace what surface peoples considered evil. But alternative visions of Drow identity had emerged and could not be suppressed. The followers of Eilistrae, though few in number, maintained communities where Drow lived without slavery and attempted to build harmonious relationships with surface peoples. These communities faced constant pressure from traditionalists who viewed them as traitors, but they persisted, offering a refuge for those who wanted to escape the cycle of violence and treachery that characterized mainstream Drow life. The worshippers of Veraun pursued their own vision of Drow supremacy, one that elevated males to equal status with females, and that emphasized conquest and infiltration of surface societies rather than isolation in the Underdark. Other factions followed different deities or rejected divine authority entirely, attempting to chart courses based on philosophy or pragmatism rather than religious devotion. The question of whether Drow were inherently evil or merely products of a corrupt culture became a matter of intense debate among surface scholars and adventurers who encountered them. The traditional view held that Drow were irredeemable, so thoroughly corrupted by Lolth's influence and their own choices that no individual Drow could be trusted. This perspective was supported by countless stories of betrayal, cruelty, and treachery, by the evidence of the slave pens and the torture chambers that characterized every major Drow city. But the existence of renegades like Driz Duerden and the communities of Eilistrae's followers suggested that Drow could change, that given different circumstances and freed from Lolth's dominion, they might develop societies as moral as any other races. The debate was complicated by the curse itself, which raised questions about responsibility and free will. Were the Drow guilty for their actions, or were they victims of divine punishment, acting out patterns imposed upon them by gods they had not chosen to offend? The great houses of Menzoberranzan continued their eternal dance of power, rising and falling according to patterns established millennia ago. House Baenre maintained its position as first house through a combination of military might, magical power, and shrewd political maneuvering. Its matron commanded respect and fear from every other house in the city, backed by legions of warriors and the clear favor of Lolth herself. But even House Baenre remained vulnerable to the intricate plots and counterplots that defined Drow politics. Ambitious matrons in lesser houses constantly sought weaknesses they could exploit, advantages that might allow them to rise in the rankings or even challenge for supremacy. The rules of engagement had been refined over centuries to balance the need for internal competition against the danger of weakening Drow civilization as a whole. Lolth's clergy enforced prohibitions against certain tactics while encouraging others, creating a framework within which ruthlessness could flourish without destroying the system it operated within. In the Underdark, beyond the great cities, Drow territory expanded and contracted according to the fortunes of war and diplomacy. The network of tunnels and caverns that made up the subterranean realm was contested by numerous powers, none of which could claim absolute dominion. The Drow held significant territories and major cities, but they shared the Underdark with Duergar kingdoms, Mindflayer enclaves, deep gnome settlements, and countless smaller communities of various races. Trade and warfare intermingled as these powers interacted, creating a complex web of relationships that shifted constantly. Alliances formed and dissolved based on immediate interests rather than lasting principles. Today's trading partner might become tomorrow's target for a slave raid, and yesterday's bitter enemy might become an ally against a common threat. The Drow navigated these relationships with the same cunning they applied to internal politics, always seeking advantage and always prepared for betrayal. Surface raids continued as both economic necessity and cultural tradition. Young Drow warriors earned their first honors by participating in attacks on surface communities, bringing back slaves and plunder to enhance their houses' wealth and status. These raids served as training exercises where theoretical knowledge was tested against actual combat conditions. They also functioned as religious rituals, demonstrations of Drow superiority, and offerings to Lolth of captives who would become sacrifices or slaves. The surface world's defenses against Drow raids improved over the centuries, as experience taught which precautions worked and which did not. Communities near known entrances to the Underdark maintained vigilant watches and prepared defensive measures. Temples offered blessings against Drow magic. Adventuring companies specialized in hunting down raiding parties and pursuing them into the tunnels. But the raids never stopped completely, because the Underdark offered too many possible routes to the surface for all of them to be guarded effectively. The arts and culture of the Drow continued to develop in directions that reflected their unique circumstances. They created works of dark beauty that surface observers found simultaneously fascinating and repulsive. Their literature explored themes of betrayal, ambition, and the exercise of power with sophistication that rivaled the greatest surface writers. Their visual arts achieved technical excellence in service of subject matter that celebrated cruelty and dominance. Their music employed scales and instruments that produced sounds both haunting and disturbing, compositions that evoked the Underdark's alien landscapes and the psychological complexity of constant warfare. This was a genuine culture, not merely an absence of civilization, but a fully realized artistic tradition with its own aesthetics and values. That these values appalled those who encountered them did not diminish their internal coherence or the skill with which Drow artists expressed them. Magic remained central to everything the Drow did, from warfare to art to daily survival. Their wizards continued to push boundaries, exploring combinations of shadow magic, Underdark phenomena, and traditional arcane theory that produced unique capabilities. They became experts at enchantment and illusion, understanding that controlling minds and perceptions could be more effective than raw destructive power. They developed spells that interacted with the Underdark's unique environmental features, using Fezres and other exotic energies to fuel effects impossible on the surface. And they maintained grimoires that contained knowledge accumulated over thousands of years. Magical traditions passed down through generations and refined by experience. These grimoires were treasures more valuable than gold to the houses that possessed them, representing competitive advantages that could determine survival in the constant struggle for dominance. The priestesses of Lolth continued to dominate religious life despite the existence of alternative deities. The Spider Queen's clergy maintained the Great Temple in Menzoberranzan and similar structures in every major Drow city, conducting rituals that reinforced Lolth's connection to her people and channeled her power into practical effects. They interpreted signs and omens, determining which houses held divine favor and which had fallen from grace. They administered the tests that confirmed young priestesses in their vocations, brutal trials that eliminated those who lacked the strength and cunning Lolth demanded. And they served as Lolth's voice, pronouncing judgments that could elevate houses or condemn them to destruction. The power they wielded was both religious and temporal, making them the most influential figures in Drow society despite their complete dependence on Lolth's continued blessing. The question of the Drow's future remained open and contested. Some believed that Drow civilization had reached a stable equilibrium, that it would continue indefinitely in its current form with only superficial changes. Others argued that the cracks that had appeared during the silence of Lolth would eventually widen, that the existence of alternatives would gradually erode the monolithic devotion that had characterized the Drow for so long. A few visionaries imagined radical transformations, scenarios where the Drow might eventually reconcile with their surface cousins, or where Lolth's dominion might be overthrown from within. But such speculation remained purely theoretical, advanced by outcasts and dissidents whose voices carried little weight in the councils of power. The reality was that the great houses continued to rule. The priestesses maintained their iron grip on religious authority. The raids continued, and the slaves suffered as they had for thousands of years. The legacy of the Elithieri, those elves who had been cursed and cast down so long ago, had become something far more complex than simple tragedy or divine justice. The Drow were not merely cursed victims, but a civilization that had taken their punishment and transformed it into a source of identity and strength. They had rejected the possibility of redemption in favor of perfecting themselves as they were, dark elves whose very existence challenged the moral certainties of the surface world. They had created works of terrible beauty, developed philosophies of profound sophistication in service of values most found abhorrent, and demonstrated that civilization could flourish even in the harshest environments if built on sufficiently ruthless principles. Whether they would ever truly change, whether the curse could be broken or transcended, whether some portion of them might eventually find paths back to the light, remained questions without definitive answers. But their story, spanning from the ancient forests of Faerie through the catastrophe of the Crown Wars to the dark grandeur of their Underdark cities, was complete in itself, a testament to adaptation, survival, and the complex relationship between punishment and identity. The Drow endured in the darkness, masters of their realm, servants of their goddess, heirs to a legacy of fall and transformation that had made them something unique among all the peoples of Toril. Their cities thrived in the lightless depths, their houses waged their eternal conflicts, their priestesses channeled divine power in service of a goddess who demanded everything and offered no forgiveness. And in the tunnels and caverns of the Underdark, they moved through shadows that were both their curse and their home, forever marked by what had been done to them, forever defined by what they had chosen to become in response. The darkness held them, shaped them, and gave them purpose, and they had long since ceased to imagine any other way of being.